Hi, my name is Mike Martin, and I know that is confusing because my father really isn't Mike Martin, and I'm really not Mike Martin. But we both have gone through life, went through life, my father and I go through life as Mike Martin. The story is that my father was born Alvin Bennett Martinson in Bellingham, Washington in 1906. And he was born with some sort of deficiency in his eyes, and so he wore these heavy Coke bottle type round horn-rimmed glasses and made him look like an owl. And when he was 5 years old, Dad and his family all moved next door to another family in Bellingham on Forest Street who had a son who was also a 5-year-old, and his name was Alvin. So you had Alvin and Alvin. And there was a cartoon character in the Bellingham Herald who had Coke bottle glasses, and his name in the cartoon was Mike. And because Dad had these thick glasses and there were two Alvins, they started calling my dad Mike, and it stuck. And so almost all the papers you would read about the history of CRISTA Ministries is that AB, quote, Mike Martin. And I was born Stanley Michael Martin. And when I was 3 years old, Uncle Stanley, who was married to my dad's sister Pearl, ran away with another woman. And those Norwegian Lutherans were not very pleased with my being called Stanley any longer because of what he had done. And so I was changed to Michael. And when I was a boy, I was called Michael and Dad was called Mike. And then after Dad passed away and just over time, I have morphed myself into Mike. When I first came here, I was 11 years old. And so my perspective is very different than anybody. And you can't fully appreciate how things were. I'm going to just tell you about this room. And you know, this is my home. When I say I was raised here, the president's office was our apartment. When I say I was raised here, I was raised here. I was married here. When I first came here, all these hallways were such a shamble. And this is a story of tuberculosis as well. And tuberculosis was such a loathsome disease, and I'm going to talk about it when we get on the tour further, but it was such a loathsome disease that people died. 70% of the people who got tuberculosis died. The only cure was no medication. Now they have various mycins that they will give you and penicillin type drugs, but they would actually take the ribs off of these patients so that there'd be no pressure on their lungs so that they could breathe. And when they were healed, they were so infirm because of no rib cage, their lives were terribly. And there were 500 beds available on this site. And they turned away people daily who begged to come here because this was the only hope. And that was only 30% hope, but there was the only hope that they had of surviving. And so the end of World War II came, and the Navy hospital over at Lake City was abandoned, decommissioned, I think it would be the word they would use. And they moved lock, stock, and barrel over to that. Have any of you been over there? Those buildings are ugly. And this beautiful site was abandoned in 1947. Actually, they closed it down in 46, and they moved over there in early 47. And they could handle 1,350 cases there. So they took everybody on the patient wait list to be able to go to that. When I was a very little boy in Goldendale, Washington, my dad had the second of his remarkable appearances of God in his life when he was called into full-time Christian service. And it's kind of amazing. I was the baby of the family, and he had 3 kids. He had a prosperous business. He owned oil distribution in eastern Washington and was doing very well financially. And in fact, he owned his own business as well as working for Richfield, which is now called Arco. And this call of God said, there are so many lost, and what are you going to do to serve me? And that call went right through his system into the very viscera of who he was. And he sold his business, he quit his job, and he came over to Seattle, thinking that if he's going to go into Christian service, all he had was a Christian high school education, that he needed some Christian training because he didn't know the Bible. Well, he was not a churched man at that point. I mean, they went to church, but it was not the kind of piety that he exposed in his adult life. And he came over and enrolled at Simpson Bible Institute. And that's all chronicled in his book, By Faith, of all that call and the remarkableness of him doing that. And literally, he would work all night fixing tires. They would retread tires during World War II. And then he'd go to school in the daytime. And one of the requirements of Simpson Bible Institute is that all of the people who were students had to do some sort of practical Christian service. And because of a desire of my sister to have some sort of high school Christian club, Bible club, which were not available in the Seattle schools, he decided to start King's Teens, and that's really how King's Schools got its name, and the King's Garden, which was the original name of the facility here. He started King's Teens, and it was just remarkable because of his charisma, because of his godliness, because of his sense of humor and fun and attractiveness. By 1947, he started in 1943. When I was just 5 years old. And in 1943, he started with 4 kids. And I was one of the 4 kids. My brother and sister were the other one, and the neighbor girl was the 4th. And from those 4 kids, 70 clubs of about 60 to 100 kids were meeting weekly throughout the whole Pacific Northwest. Remarkable success. It was a pattern after Young Life. Young Life and King's Teens actually started about the same time. So it was a good time for kids. It was a time for kids to find Christ and to learn the Bible and to enjoy wonderful Christian fellowship. In that process, a girl at school with my sisters named Joanne Paping said, Joyce, can I come and sleep at your house tonight? I have no place to sleep tonight. And Joyce said, sure, you can come home and stay at my place. And we did not formally adopt Joanne, but Joanne came and lived with us until, well, she's really part of our family to this day. She lives now in Moses Lake. And Dad got this notion. There are other kids who come to Christ at King's Teens clubs, and there ought to be a place for them. And so their idea was to get a farm, take maybe a barn, and they'd make a 2-story dormitory out of it. And my mom and Dad could sort of be dorm parents to these people. And he shared this with a missionary who had come to our church in Seattle and said, this is my vision. And he said, the missionary said, that's exactly what you ought to do. Do you know of any other place? And Dad said, well, would you like to go for a Sunday drive? And it was very common for Christian parents. I don't know if it was common with all society to go on a Sunday afternoon drive in Dad's car. So I'm quite sure I was with them, but the missionary, I know my brother went because he recalls it. I don't recall it, but I pretty well tagged along because I was quite a bit younger than the other children. And in those days, they didn't really use babysitters, so I probably was drug out here with them. And they came out to the deserted Furlan Tuberculosis Sanitarium, which is what this facility was. It is a little hard for you to envision what was here almost 70 years ago. But where I am is where there was a great big fish pond. This is a representation of the original fish pond, and it's a phony waterfall too. It's a phony pond and it's a phony waterfall. But the real thing is I'm up to my knees in this water, in water of this fish pond. And it was probably a quarter of an acre, big, more like the Frosh Pond at the University of Washington, not that big. And I would love to tell you it was underneath that tree that my mom and dad knelt and prayed. I have no clue. But if you would accept it, well, let's take that one. But it was on one of these trees that surrounded this gigantic, and Dad, I don't know how you were raised. You're younger than me, but I don't know how you were raised. But in the good old days after World War II, on Sunday afternoon after church, dads took their children on a drive. And every Sunday afternoon, Dad would drive us somewhere. And he said, I've heard of a place called Furlands, and I'm going to go out there. I don't remember. I'd love again. It was that tree, and I was here, and I can remember it as clear as all get out. That's not true. But I'm sure I must have been with them. I was raised differently than you guys are raising your children. You know how I was raised? I went with them. And Dad would preach almost every night because he was raising money to do all this stuff. And Mom would go with them because that was her practice. And I was the baby of the family, and I'd go and sleep through more Mike Martin sermons than anybody in the history of people. Anyhow, it was right here. And he said, and Dad was one of these, I have trouble with some of the theology of it. I'm not being coarse about it. I've embraced the wonderful outpouring of God's Spirit, well, in my life just this spring, but in his life in very special ways. But he took the Bible literally, that it was written just for him. So Joshua 1:2 was, everywhere the sole of your feet will trod, I will give you. He takes off his shoes and socks and he walks up that sidewalk and he walks around these grounds and he claims them for the Lord. When they interviewed him, when he made the application to come out here to Furlands, they said, how much education have you had? And he said, well, I went to Simpson Bible Institute for 3 years, but I didn't graduate. Oh, that was impressive. They said, how much money do you have? And he said, well, not very much. Well, Mom used to handle the finances, and I know his allowance was $5 a week. Now, that's more than it is now, but he could buy peanuts, and because he preached all the time, he didn't want to have bad breath. Have any of you had Sen-Sen? He would buy Sen-Sen and stick it in so his breath would not be offensive. And he had enough money to put the nickel in the parking meter downtown when he would go to the Christian businessmen's prayer meetings. That was how much money. So when he said not very much, I mean, he meant $5. And they said, well, what do you have? And he smiles and he says, I have a promise from God that this is going to be my place. And he said, I took off my shoes and socks and walked around this place claiming it for the Lord. And the report came back, it would be better to let the place go to rack and ruin than to give it to a religious nut like Mike Martin. And so Dad got Axel Ferdinand. Somebody mentioned Axel Ferdinand to me, and I don't know who else. I think Kenny Johnson. And they went down, we're going to go down there right now, to a little cabin. In fact, the Bergs lived there, Tyler. And they prayed and said, Lord, we got it wrong. And a year later, they gave this place to Dad for $1 a year. Remember, are you keeping score on all the reasons why this place could happen? No debt. When I retired in 2002, I sat down and calculated square footage and all this stuff, and I came up with $1 billion. This place was, in 2002, was worth $1 billion. Well, there's not a denomination or Christian organization that can come up and cough up. CRISTA can't. $1 billion to get this place. So they got it, no debt. That's the best price of all.
In August, he wrote incorporation papers, which are just remarkably prescient to what CRISTA is doing today. Worldwide radio and TV and schools and all these kinds of things were in. All he had was a little high school Bible club, 70 of them, but that's all he had. And he wrote this grandiose incorporation papers.
Take a look at this place. This is just so cool. But when you see look at you can't even look at this new oak. That's lovely, but that's nothing. Look at this stuff behind you on these. They would cut these oak trees on a bevel so that the ripple would be much more pronounced, and you couldn't even buy this stuff. Would you believe that the first bond issue for building this building, the city of Seattle sold it for $10,000. I looked up the records, and this was designed by an architect who also designed Cambridge University, and his name was Anderson. He won. They had a contest and so they built these beautiful buildings. And this building was built in 1911 for 150. It was finished in 13, but started in 1911, and they paid $150,000 for it. Just love it. As lovely as this is, you can't believe how atrocious it was. When Furland Tuberculosis Sanitarium left, they abandoned the place. Now, if you even go like to an abandoned school, they'll put plywood over the windows and winterize it. They did nothing. So these floors had a double cross. You know, the American Lung Association, the Anti-Tuberculosis League, have this double cross. And the floors were all buckled because moisture had come in. Mold was growing on the walls. And in the end of World War II, there was such an invasion of rats in this area in North King County that they put cats in here to keep the rats down. There was not nice kitty litter and cleaning up afterwards. So when you came in here, green mold on the walls and buckled floors and actually water dripping from the steam pipes and all this stuff. The ceilings were sagged. And these workers came out here and started working for $35 a month, cleaning up the worst disease-ridden facility in the world. Tuberculosis killed you. When I first started teaching school, every year I had to go get a x-ray to keep my teaching license, and they don't do that anymore. But tuberculosis was, and I know there's some back today, but it wasn't like it was then. And you could get tuberculosis so much easier than almost it's just like catching a cold. Someone sneezes and off go all the germs, and you can catch it. So the place was cleaned up, and I don't know. I don't have no idea. But how would you like to wash mold off of a sanatorium that smelled as bad as any place you've ever been? My first job when I got here with my brother Kurt was to go get some gunny sacks, and we caught these feral. There were about 50 cats, and we put the cats in these gunny sacks, put them in the same room that we just talked in, and then we took them down to the Humane Society. I suppose they didn't let them live, but they were wild, awful cats. I've told you things. This is not a speech, it's a tour. But the first thing is that there was, it was miraculous that these lovely buildings were available. It's a real miracle. The second thing is I also mentioned very skilled workers. If you look at the construction out here, that was done by a man by the name of Jake Pauls, who worked for $35 a month like everybody else. And they just did marvelous quality work, working for the Lord. And I don't know what $35 a month is today. I'm going to say, let's just say it's a couple $1,000. You can't live on a couple $1,000 with a family. You just simply can't do it. And these people came, and yet when they would come back to the King's Garden or a garden workers reunion in the summertime, which was run by my Uncle Vern, they said those were the happiest days of their lives.
When the decision was finally made, there were 3 county commissioners. Now we have the King County Council, and it's a large, I think it's 10 members. There was a commissioner of the South District, commissioner of the North District, and there was a commissioner of the North District where this facility is. And Dean McLean was the one, and he became friends with my dad. And Dad one day said, Dean, wouldn't you really like to know that you're going to go to heaven and have a relationship with Christ? And Dean McLean says, I don't know anything about it. And he led Dean McLean to faith in Jesus Christ. I have a diary of my dad's. And in it, he has notes from Dean McLean, who had given him the diary, and says, thank you for what you did to lead me to faith in Christ. And it was just a beautiful story. Well, immediately you had one supporter, and this is long before King's Garden got started, of the three people who really made the final decision. And the Central District was another person, and the South District was another person. One of those was a Democrat, and one was a Republican. Dean McLean was a Republican. And so he persuaded the other Republican to vote with him, and by a vote of 2-1, they approved a $1 a year lease for this place.
It is interesting that most people think that this is all one building. You are in a bridge between two buildings. That building up there is the administration building, and this was the more utilitarian side of this facility. And I'm going to, when we get into the auditorium, I will give you a little more background of what was going on here. This was the dining room. Now, when King's Garden started, Dad put out the call to churches for people to come and sign on to do the Lord's work. And 75 families came out in that very first year. Now, if you think about that, and it was $35, everybody got the same salary. My dad got $35, the custodian got $35, everybody got $35. Mom got $35, so they actually had, because there were two workers, they got a total of $70 a month. And room and board. Okay, now I told you that the stories get all mixed up. But tuberculosis was so bad, they started to do the sanatorium thing, which is total rest kinds of places. And the first place they did it is at Rogers Field on Queen Anne, which is very near Seattle Pacific University. And all the moms walked around with signs saying, no pest house on Queen Anne Hill. And so Horace Henry, who was the owner of the Interurban Railroad, had a son, Walter, and this was the first name of this building, was Walter Henry Building. Then the board renamed it years ago, I know the year, 78, in honor of my father. But it was called the Walter Henry Administration Building. And he donated 34 acres. Now this is 55 acres. They bought later the land that became the elementary school, and then they bought the Woolsey Field area as 3. So there were 3 different purchases of land. But the first was a donation from the Horace Henry. And any of you who drive around here very much, if you go down to 155th and Aurora, 99, and there's overpasses there. That's the leftover of the Interurban Railroad, which was built solely to bring stuff out to Richmond Highlands. And when they first built this line out here to bring sheets and food and medications and people, they would stop and they would have to walk from 185th and Aurora up here. And how they got the foodstuffs, they'd have wheelbarrows and they would wheel stuff out to here. Come on into the kitchen. This was a very typical hospital construction. The bakery was over there. They had a storage for cans and foodstuffs over here. Can you see the notch in the ceiling? That notch in the ceiling is where and the grill was right here. And so the smoke would be ventilated out. Where you're all standing in that row over there is where there was a stainless steel table, and you would come through and we'd put the meatloaf and the potatoes on and that. And then over behind that map is a elevator. So in order to feed the people in the hospital, they had to take what they called steam carts. What they were great big old steel carts with huge wheels on them, and they'd put hot water in the bottom of them to keep the food warm. And Dad had a rule, and this was an interesting part of I think it was brilliant. So I'm not looking at it with sadness. I look at it with a warm memory. When you turn 13 years old, I had 2 years of absolution, but when you turned 13, you had to work 9 hours a week. Now remember, all the students lived here. This was a dormitory place. And the kids all had to work 9 hours a week. And so I worked 9 hours a week. I washed pots and pans over there. I washed dishes over there. And you won't believe it now looking at me, but when I was 13 years old, I probably weighed as much as 75 pounds, and it was probably as big as about 5'3". And you get going down the tunnels, and it's downhill, and the thing weighs more than you by probably 100 pounds. I'll show you a couple of smiles I put on that location. But I did all sorts of things. I loved the landscape. Any of you are real gardeners, so I really enjoyed doing that stuff. Well, George Woolsey Field, he started the cemetery in Yakima, and he did all the landscaping and all the grass. And so he got the call of God to come here. He was one of those original pioneers. He came to Washington State on a wagon and came out here and started his family in Yakima, but he was a wonderful Christian man. He came here and was a gardener. He taught me I know more about rhododendrons than anybody. And he was just a marvelous. They asked, would anybody want to be the garbage man? And I'll tell you that story in a minute, but I said, sure, I want to be the garbage man. They said, well, do you know how to drive a truck? Oh, yes, I lied. And so they had an old Model T truck that had been donated, a flatbed. And what happened is all the garbage from here, you'd have wet garbage and you'd have dry garbage. And the wet garbage went down to where Woolsey Field is, because that was the farm. And we would feed pigs, and we had livestock down there and chickens. And I had to go get my brother to teach me how to drive so I could drive my garbage. So I learned to driving a garbage truck for Jesus. These tunnels, this particular tunnel was designed to be used as a transportation corridor. Everything went through this tunnel. Remember I told you about the big old steam carts I used to push? At the bottom here, you take a left, and you might see a few smiles along that cement wall put on by youngsters just like me. And they would bring dead bodies through here. The morgue was on the other side. The bodies would come through here. Believe it or not, they averaged about 350 deaths a year. If you got 350 deaths a year, I guess that sounds like almost one every day. This was called the Detweiler Hospital. And I don't know if any of you have looked up tuberculosis. The two cures were total bed rest and fresh air. And so if you look at the back side of this ward here, you can see that it has much higher windows than you would have in any 1911 design building. And a little boy got tuberculosis, an Alaskan Indian child, and his last name is Joseph with a F rather than a PH at the end. And he died in this facility, and his father was a prosperous fisherman, Alaskan fisherman. And he said, it's not right that children are going to die in the first place, and I want them to be surrounded in a children's type hospital. So in 1927, he donated the money for that children's hospital. The first reason why you had a real successful start, you had a great leader who was able to raise money and attract people to work. You had people who would work. The labor force was
cheap. I mean, it's just, in an hour, CRISTA is spending more than they'd spend in an annual budget for labor. So you had cheap labor of quality labor. You had buildings that were able to be converted. Down there was a ward for the hospital. And you can see again, it has taller than average windows because the fresh air and sunlight, and they left the windows open. So it must have been cold in there. I don't know, that part of the story, I wasn't here then. This is one of my favorite stops on the tour. I told you earlier, and I didn't beat the tuberculosis drum long enough, but total rest. They wouldn't let them read. They couldn't listen to the radio. They couldn't read. One of the things that they were very concerned about was sexual activity. So the men were all waited on by male nurses, the females by female nurses. They felt anything that would stimulate the blood and get your activity up would kill you. So it was a dreadful healing, and yet this was the waiting pond for the children's hospital. So this, I swam in here when I was a kid. It would be about 4 feet in the center, and if you didn't mind getting your knee scratched, you could actually swim in here. And the kids would come out here and splash in the waiting pond, which sounds like it's opposite of what I told you that was a cure. So you're going to ask somebody who knows why this is here. If you look at these beams, there was a horse barn in Linwood. Remember, this was horse country. I told you in passing that when I moved out here, there were horses all over the place. And these beams were there, and they gave these beams to my dad for free if he could get someone who would bring them to the facility. And right over yonder, which is where the girls' dorm was a front porch. Why would there be a front porch on an infirmary at a tuberculosis? Because they would wheel the beds out and they could get the fresh air and sunlight. So they put these beams, and they stayed there probably 10 years after my dad's death. And I remember I mentioned Jake Paul, this great, wonderful Christian man, and Jim Butler, and some of these heroes of the Christian faith. They took and cobbled together a design to put all these beams and put the lid over it, and there were no walls. Okay, so now we had a covered play shed. And Nick was the first big man at George Fox College, as it was called in those days. And so he wanted to have a basketball, so he put a basketball hoop on each end, and they played basketball. And when Ken became the superintendent, he said, we have to have a first-class library. And the kids all met in a chapel up in the, and I'm going to take you there, but up in the high school building. And they decided to make this into an auditorium. And so this is it. Does it look a little funky? It works great. It's sort of like the Mormon Tabernacle building where you have this wonderful acoustics for everything. How did King's Garden come about as a name? When Dad sold his business and came to Seattle, he went to Simpson Bible Institute. And he was 37 years old. They were starting to go to Bible school. And they made all of the students in those days do practical Christian work. And so Dad thought he would start a Bible club for kids. And so he had to come up with a name for it. And so he called it King's Teens. And Kings was the King of Kings, and teens, obviously, was teenagers. And so that's how that was named. And over the years, World Concern was part of the problem why they changed the name to CRISTA. When they would go and give foodstuffs in the name of King's Garden, they thought maybe it had come from the King of England. Rather than a Christian not-for-profit organization. And the other part of it is that people did get, I told you I'm an expert on rhododendrons because I lived at King's Garden. And they would call up and always want to buy rhododendrons and trees and shrubs and get design. So they thought that was kind of a stupid name. And so CRISTA is sort of like Exxon and some of these other names. It's just a made-up name. And I don't know why it doesn't have an H in there, but I suppose that, I don't mean to embarrass anybody, but they beat the H out of CRISTA. So Now, this seems like a strange spot, but I have 2 or 3 stories. That was the boys' dormitory. And now we use it as the Early Childhood Education Center. That's the only left of the apartment buildings, but that was apartments for workers who worked here. And most of those workers were in charge of the farm. There was another long building that goes along that fence, and that was an apartment building. There was another long one that came here, and that was an apartment building. And then the one that was sort of out in the middle of this now pond going to the garages was where the girls' dorm was, and that's where they put those big beams that my dad got for free. Over there where those cars are, is one of the miracles, and it is, and in fact, Tyler, your great-grandfather was a participant in this, and because he was a boiler man. That's how Marvella, his grandma, got here. She's one of my friends. And over in that corner, remember I said Horace Henry owned the inner urban, and they eventually built a railroad line out and would bring fuel for the facility, boiler. That's the powerhouse with the chimney. And we came out here and no one knew much of anything. There was no manual saying, here, oil is here. And they ran out of the tank of oil that they had. And one of the reasons why they let Dad have this place for $1 a year, he had to promise to start this rest home that the nurse came over and said I was in bad shape. And so he had probably 100 frail elderly, where Sylvan Hall is where really very frail people were. And there was no heat. Well, not good thing. So in that same room we started in, they had an all-night vigil and pray, and they prayed all night. I don't know how long all night was, but go with a long time. They prayed, and the next morning, and it wasn't your great-grandpa, one of the workers came and found a pipe that came over the side of the hill. And there buried underneath the hill were 3 tanker cars clear full of oil. And it is those kinds of miracles that happen on a continual basis. They were able to heat the place and that was the coldest, 1950 was the coldest winter in the history, 49 was the coldest winter in the history of Seattle. That was the worst. And we had oil by the buckets. When Dad, I told you he was a real visionary and a fundraiser, he had a 15-minute broadcast every day on Cairo. And Cairo got bought by the Mormons, who really did not want a Protestant fundraiser on their thing, and so they kicked him off the air. So he came back home and he was kind of mortified that this had happened to him. He said, I think God wants me to start a radio station. When Dad got permission to start the radio station, which was done with appropriate certification and consultants and all that, the engineers were all involved, they said, Mr. Martin, we also have an FM channel. Are you interested in that? Well, in those days, FM was something, they didn't know what that was. And he said, well, why not? Well, when I retired the year before, which was 2001, Cairo came back to try and buy that radio station and offered $35 million for it. There's no enterprise that is as valuable. But when he went up to his office, which was right next to the president's office, we lived in the president's office, and his office was the first one on the left. He brought in a gal by the name of Cappy Frisbee, who was a major donor to the organization. And they prayed. And my uncle came, and my mom came, and my dad, and Cappy Frisbee, and I think Axel was there too. And they prayed, and they said, well, we're going to put the radio tower down on the farm area. I'll show you where it was and why that's a miracle. Now we're going to hike a little ways. I have some other stories to tell, but come with. We're going to walk now. All right, this is, again, one of those kinds of things that would never happen again. But this was the garbage dump. Now remember I told you that I lied and said I could drive, and I would used to drive the garbage truck and put the rear of the garbage truck back here and throw all the paper goods and burnable stuff here. And then I would get an old rubber tire, fill it full of kerosene and throw a match on it, and smoke would billow out right here. Isn't that the awfulest thing you ever heard in your life? We are repulsed by that notion now. And there were 5 rows of farm buildings built here. And so they grew hogs. You see where it says Woolsey Stadium and where the sign is? That was a chicken coop. The first gift that Dad got as a gift to King's Garden were 500 chickens. And we would go and gather the eggs, and that's what we would eat, and they sold some. And they had steer down there and animals, and that's just because they wouldn't let people go back and forth. And so this was supposed to be we had our own fire department, we had our own water department. Eventually they got water from the city, but it wasn't at first. It was water from off of this site. It was to keep the people here and away from the population. You know, the Bible talks about people with leprosy and they would ring a bell. It's hard to get leprosy, easy to get this. And so George Woolsey, who taught me to love gardening, I had told you about him, when he got this vision of making a football field for the kids. So, and how he made his cemetery in Yakima is that he just raked rocks off of it and planted grass seed, and eventually they had enough space for the cemetery. So all the kids who would get in trouble had to come down here. You didn't get detention. You had to go rake rocks for Mr. Woolsey. I've raked a few rocks off of that field. This is a lovely facility, obviously, and at the end I'll show you a couple of things, and then you can see one of the apartments. One of the things I like about the senior living department at CRISTA is that we take care of people of all incomes. It's not just those who can afford a nicer one. Some can, and this is obviously one of those that is one of the nicer facilities. Well, the nicest facility of the senior community. When I told you earlier that the first thing that ever started here was not, remember, it was all started because of kids. The goal was kids, and the first ministry was to senior citizens. And believe it or not, that has been the financial spine of CRISTA from the get-go. If they hadn't been forced to do that, they couldn't do all the other ministry that did develop. And in the lives of people, what it means to the families, to know that people are getting Christian loving care. 2 organizations. I'm real proud of my brother Kurt. He was the president at Seattle Pacific University, and he was instrumental. He was executive vice president at that time, and Cedar Demery, who died in this facility, was the president. And they got a requirement that all employees at Seattle Pacific and CRISTA be Christian. And a lot of Christian organizations cannot discriminate on the basis of faith, but we are one of them. And because of that, the Christian witness and the Christian service, wonderful. I'll tell you a funny story about Dave Passay, who none of you would know, but Dave was my chaplain when I had the nursing center. And he was a Baptist, so you got anybody here Baptist, you can nod your head and look wise. And this gal found Christ through his ministry in the hospital, in the nursing home, and she wanted to be baptized. Well, she was feeble and frail. I said, "You are not going to baptize this gal in a tank of water." And he said, "Well, Mike, what am I going to do?" And I said, "Well, I know what you're going to do. You're going to become a Presbyterian for just a little while." And so he came, and that was on a Sunday, and on Monday I came in just to sort of tease him a little bit. And I said, "Dave, how did it go?" And he said, "Well," he said, "I poured." But he said, "I poured a lot of water." I will say, and this is not politics on my part, but Bob Lonick has just been an absolutely fine president for CRISTA. I so appreciate his ministry and what he's accomplished. This is the third building that he's going to renovate. His grandpa had an awful lot to do with the design of the weight room and the locker room and stuff. But that gym, if you go in there to the big gym, which is the more olive, darker olive part, there's more banners in our high school than any high school in America. They've won state championship after state championship. And the one that makes me most pleased is they generally win the sportsmanship award, and they generally win the academic award. That is the highest ranked team with the highest grade point average. My grandson Noah is here, and it just cheers me up a lot to have Noah Martin in the school. And one of the things that was an attraction to him, he's a freshman, one of the things that was an attraction to him was the robotics program. But I want to tell you that story because it is so typical, and if I could hear your stories, you would be telling me some of the same stuff. A man, and his name escapes me, I've met him, and if I were to dig long enough, it would come, but I'm not going to dig. Worked for Microsoft, and he had a very well-paying job at Microsoft. And he felt like he was not having the kind of meaning in his life that he wanted. He wanted to be in ministry of some sort. So he was into robotics and that stuff for Microsoft type things. So he came out and applied to be the robotics teacher here. So because of Noah, I went around and talked to him, and you could just guess I do gab some. And I said to him, I said, tell me a little bit about your robotics program. He said, my robotics program is my ministry. And I thought, how cool. You know, assisted living was invented on this facility by Darrell Meyer. It was the first assisted living facility. Great minds have put together enormously successful programs and things. This thing is the state of the art. There's not a high school in America that has anything finer than this. And this was all done with donation money, which is still coming in for God's purposes on this campus, as is the junior high. That I told Bob Ruhlman, because we were talking about a mission trip, and who's the principal, and I said, Bob, I said, we need to do this for the high school. He said, I'm with you all the way, so maybe they'll get something going for that.
So my optimism for the future of CRISTA is so high, and to have had my family play such a vital role in it, and to have been able to have sort of come back to the family farm, and I know that sounds terribly self-centered, and I'm not, was such a blessing to me, and such an encouragement to my own spiritual life, let alone my whole family. I have a grandson going to King's schools here. This is just exciting to me. So I'm very, very pleased with what progress is being made, the professionalism, just the way things are done.